Welcome back. This week, a judge really put the cat among the pigeons in Britain's biggest ever medical scandal. He suggested that the government should pay compensation now to haemophiliacs given the AIDS virus in contaminated blood. Now, many have already died, and nearly 1,000 more who may face death are suing the government for compensation. So, should the government pay up, or should it continue to deny all responsibility? The scandal broke 5 years ago when an alarming number of haemophiliacs started dying from the AIDS virus. What they'd needed was a concentrate called factor VIII to help their blood clot. What they got was a deadly disease. 140 have already died, and many more will before legal action decides the matter. The government has already made one-off payments of £20,000. But that's less than a year's wages to families who have no prospect of insuring against the near certainty of losing a major breadwinner. The infected factor VIII was imported from America, where drug users and homosexuals have commonly been free to sell their blood. The government says the health service shouldn't be blamed for the contaminated blood. Lawyers and politicians have time to argue, but for patients like Bob Threakle, time is running out. Bob, we've just seen you in the film there. How long do you think you have left to live?
That's the hardest thing to cope with, actually, because I'm not sure how long I've got. I've lost nearly 2 stone in weight over the past 12 months. And should that continue, then obviously I've only got perhaps another year or so to go. Hard to speculate. A year, 2 years.
Who do you blame for all this?
I've got to blame the government. It's got to be their fault. There can be nobody else that I can blame. They were the ones that, through the health service, gave me this factor VIII, which would purported to do me good. And in fact, it's done me nothing but harm at the end of the day.
Zena Morgan, your husband was a haemophiliac. He died earlier this year, aged just 44. How badly was he suffering before he died?
He was very ill for a whole year. He was extremely ill. And for 4 years before that, he'd been unable to have a job, and I'd worked instead. And he'd just gradually got iller and iller. And the last year, he was in hospital quite a bit. When he came out, he was really unable to do anything at all. He spent most of the time in bed. And until he finally knew he did just have 3 weeks left to live.
Why are you going on with this fight?
Partly for Danny, because I feel very disloyal. He was very, very angry about it, very positive about it, and for him I must do it. But also for the other people. For Danny it's too late, but for other people it isn't.
Nicholas Budgeon, 1,000 people have been contaminated by blood that was recommended, indeed prescribed by the Department of Health. And it seems now that the government is quibbling about paying compensation. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's not the government that's going to pay the compensation. It's the taxpayer who's going to pay the compensation. And the taxpayer is perfectly entitled to say, I wish to have the normal protection of the law. And the position at present is that the plaintiffs, or perhaps the people who've succeeded to the actions after others have died, have to prove either that there's been a breach of duty or that the government, the National Health Service, has been negligent. And of course, if you say there can be payment without fault, then you set the precedent for payment without fault in a whole host of cases, and you then would find, firstly, that the cost of medical care would go up absolutely enormously, and secondly, you would find that a large number of private organisations that, for instance, experiment in the field of medicine in the way that distillers did until they were forced to make extra payments, would withdraw from that sort of activity.
But Mr. Budgeon, didn't the haemophiliacs have the right to expect that blood that was given out by the Department of Health was clean, that it had been tested?
Well, I don't know about the right. Of course, they hoped that it was clean, and indeed the government hoped that it was clean. What has to be proved is that the National Health Service was negligent.
David Waters, could you prove that?
Indeed, we can. we have no less authority than 3 appeal court judges who have said that we have a very strong case in law, but the case goes beyond law, really. We are talking about a situation where people are dying, and where people are dying at the rate of 1 a week. And that's a very serious situation. And I hope that politicians who express sentiments like the one we have just had can actually live with the fact that they're consigning people to abbreviated lives, cold-bloodedly, without them enjoying the comfort of compensation.
But you're confident that you could prove your case in court?
Indeed.
The compensation, sadly, is not going to save these people suffering from this dreadful condition.
Nobody has ever said it would, but it would most certainly make people's lives easier.
But you must understand that if anybody dies, their action continues for the benefit of their estate.
Ivan Lawrence, it would seem that the reluctance of the government to go to court is a delaying tactic, and people find themselves in an unfortunate position that the plaintiffs are dying.
Well, this is a very, very emotive subject, and I'm afraid emotion is no good guide to sensible behaviour and reaction. You see, the government actually has paid, so far, £34 million of taxpayers' money, an average of £28,000 to each of the sufferers. So something has been given, and what we're talking about is whether the haemophiliac sufferers ought to have more money. Now, no judges have said that there is a case of negligence which has been proved, and what is quite wrong. All the judges have said is that there is a case for examination.
The compensation that has been paid out is £20,000, which in some cases is less than a year's wages.
It isn't compensation, it's an ex gratia payment. It's very important to understand that, because it's one thing, for instance, for the taxpayer to say about people in Ethiopia, we're very sorry for you, here is X pounds. But it's quite another thing for the taxpayer to say, I wish to establish as a precedent that I will in the future pay without proof of negligence.
Now, we obviously have taxpayers here. What would you say to that?
What about the taxpayers who want their money to be used to give compensation to the aid sufferers who are dying? You don't know. I mean, you should at least have a referendum or an opinion poll or something, because you're just deciding for the taxpayers when they might want their money to go to these people.
This gentleman.
Why can't we transfer some of the monies that we're spending on bombs or things like that, say 1% of the monies that we spend on that, and give more money to these people who need it?
Lady at the back. Lady at the back, and then you. Yes, you.
Surely, as everything was left to hope, as one of the politicians says, that they hope the blood was clean, the government should take more responsibility for their actions.
Yeah, I mean, these people put themselves in the government's hands and all they get is blood that's contaminated. I mean, surely it's their life that's at risk and all they can get is poisoned blood, whereas the government can't like, guarantee to do anything decent about it.
No. This lady here had a point.
That money isn't going to save the people that have already got the AIDS virus, so why not use it as research?
Why not use it as research? Patrick Cormack, you're a Tory MP. You don't seem to be taking the government line in all this. Why not?
Well, I thought I'd come here tonight to debate with my colleagues, which I'm very glad to do, because I've never heard so much rubbish as was talked by Nicholas Budgeon and Ivan Lawrence. I think here we're dealing with essentially a moral issue. We're not just talking about legalistic quibbles. And the fact of the matter is that these people suffered as a result of receiving blood which was administered via the National Health Service, in which they placed their trust, and they had a total right to rely upon the service. Now, I'm not saying that anybody is culpable. Of course, none of the doctors who gave that, of course, none of the nurses who looked after them were in any sense culpable. But the fact is that as a result of placing their trust in the National Health Service, instead of being given a lease of life, they were sentenced to death. And it is absolutely essential that we get rid of all this nonsense and that we give them a reasonable settlement. And the judge, who is a far more eminent lawyer than either of my colleagues, has suggested that there should be a compromise, and I believe there should be. I believe that the plaintiffs and the government lawyers should get together and there should be a settlement, because these people are dying. They're dying month by month.
These people are dying, and
yes, well, if you'll give me an opportunity to answer, because I was badly traduced by my colleague, who obviously didn't realise that I was only answering a question that I was asked. I actually agree with everything that he's just said.
So why do you think the government is reluctant?
No, please, it's no use. This programme is no good unless, if we consider something as important as this, we're given an opportunity to explain what the situation is. If we move to no-fault liability, it could be massively expensive for the whole National Health Service. If we give the haemophiliacs what they're asking for, which is £100,000 each, that will mean that 3 hospitals cannot be built, which are now being built, which would save lives. Now, I actually think that that is what ought to happen, that we ought to give up those 3 hospitals in order to pay the haemophiliacs more or less what they want, and I do think that it's a matter for the lawyers to get together to agree a settlement in the normal way, without any acceptance of particular blame. It's wrong to say that the government did anything with this blood that was wrong or improper or for which they can be blamed. They couldn't. Medical science at the time thought there was nothing wrong with that blood.
Well, we don't know that.
It's nobody's fault.
We don't know
what
that.
we're talking about is whether, as Patrick has said, we ought morally to pay, and I think we should, or whether we stick to a purely legalistic basis, which I think we shouldn't. But there is no doubt that if we stuck to the legalistic basis, there would be an issue.
Patrick Cormack.
But the fact is that what Ivan and I appear to agree, which is good, and I think that where Nicholas is so wrong, is to leave this to the course of the law. I mean, as the judge said in that very moving letter, this is something that you cannot just leave to the due process of law. Because what you do, if you do this, is that you bring our whole legal system into disrepute. And it's something that I actually care about very deeply. I care about our legal system, and if you allow this thing to grind on, the case won't come to court until March of next year. It'll be at least a year, maybe longer, before you get the first settlement, and then there'll be further quibbles. This is not the way for a civilized country to behave, and nor has any other civilized country where this has happened behaved like that. And I think the sooner we deal with it, the better.
Let's just take the first part of what Patrick said. He said that these people went to the National Health Service expecting that they would have good treatment. They did not have good treatment, and therefore payment should be made. Now, let's see how that principle is to be extended. If, for the sake of argument, I go to a surgeon and have an operation, I expect that the operation will go well, but it may not, and I might die. Does that mean that I have the right to compensation, even if the surgeon has done nothing wrong?
What do you say about that?
A completely bogus point, you see. Everyone who opposes any case in Parliament says, well, if you extend this to this case and that case, and they take it to an extreme. We're not arguing about hypothetical cases. We're arguing about people who are dying and need justice. And the fact is that the National Health Service did let them down. And you can't say it is simply a legal issue. It is a moral issue, an overwhelming moral issue, and they've got to be paid now, not at some future date. The law is inadequate. It can't deal with this problem.
Yes, it can.
Because the law takes time, and people are dying now. Now Ivan's shaking his head. There's no point in saying emotion shouldn't determine the issue. Emotion has a role to play, but we've got a reason on our side, and the reason is these people would be denied justice if it's left to the law.
No, the law will give them justice.
Was this blood tested to the best of the National Health's ability at the time?
Yeah. Well, that's what the National Health Service say.
David Waters, you should be able to answer this.
Can you prove that it wasn't tested to the best of their ability?
Let us come back.
How can you prove it's their fault?
Look, the one thing that is not in dispute is that these people, in good faith, got this blood via the National Health Service. It was supplied in good faith. Of course it was supplied in good faith. But what is not in dispute is that it was contaminated, and that therefore they, having placed their faith and their trust in the National Health Service, were let down. No individual was malicious. No
David Waters, do you think the blood was adequately tested?
I think that there could have been more tests, and there could have been a much greater commitment by the government to research and development. One of the things that Kenneth Clarke said last week was that there was nothing in the papers which the government are required to produce that was going to be of any value to the case. And that, we fear, is indeed exactly the case, that it will show that nothing was done, no even reasonable step was taken to make sure that the blood products were safe.
So you're convinced then that...
Well, then the plaintiff
I am
will win.
indeed. And there is another matter.
Nothing wrong with that.
Those plaintiffs who are still alive, Mr Budgeon, will win. But there is another point I'd like to make. Mr Budgeon is very concerned about floodgates opening. The governments are always concerned about floodgates opening. The judge in the case, in his statement, which was leaked to the Sunday Times last week, made it very clear that this was a unique case, a singular case, a special case, which was different to every other case that had ever been, and certainly in terms of numbers, different to any other case we hope will ever come along. And it's just garbage for Mr Budgeon to talk the way he does.
Ben James, you are one of these... Excuse me.
A similar case at all? Yeah. Could you tell us of a similar case, no?
Well, I think the best example is that of the distillers' case about the thalidomide. And the distillers were forced into a settlement.
That was a private company.
But the principle is the same.
That was distillers.
No, the principle is the same.
The principle is not the same.
Entirely the
The
same.
National Health Service is not a private company, it's the government.
No, the principle is the same, because if you force people into settlements...
But you can't compare
hang on,
thalidomide with
if you force
haemophilia.
people into settlements when no negligence has been proved, then you put up the cost of the service that they're providing, and some people cease to provide that service as a result of being forced to settle on terms which they would not have had to settle if they...
Hang on. That this is a unique case.
Distillers stopped that experimental work, stopped providing a very good service in medical products, and to that extent, no doubt, many people died as a result of the
You're
pressure.
dragging in red herring.
Jack Ashley,
Absolutely irrelevant. It's got nothing to do with this argument.
Jack Ashley, let me ask you. Excuse me, Mr Cormack. Jack Ashley, let me ask you then.
I don't know whether I'm allowed to answer, Patrick.
One moment, please. If you were Health Minister now, what would you be doing?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would accept the fact that this is not a legal question. It is an overriding moral question with a responsibility on the government. And I would arrange an out-of-court settlement on generous terms. I would have no doubt that the taxpayer wanted to pay, because all the press and all radio and television indicate that. As a minister, I would, on behalf of the government, say, we will settle out of court on very generous terms, and the taxpayers would support me.
OK, Ben James, let me just talk to you. Obviously, the audience agreed there with Jack Ashley. Ben James, you are one of the haemophiliacs who's been affected. You are HIV positive. What do you think about a quick, out-of-court cash settlement? Is that the answer to your predicament?
Well, I am well at the moment, and there's a fair chance I would see this court case through. And in some respects, I'd like to see it through, to see justice done, to see the blame nailed at somebody's door, wherever it might be within the government. But the problem is a lot of people aren't going to live as long as I hope to live. And they're going to die without the knowledge that their families will be cared for or will have enough financial reserves to look after themselves. And that's going to add to their suffering as they're dying from HIV.
Now, you took a tremendous gamble. You and your wife, Rosemary, you knew that you were HIV positive, but you still decided to go ahead and have a child. How did your gamble pay off?
We've been lucky. Both Rosemary and the child is well and seem to be clear of HIV. Not everybody's as lucky as we are.
And you want some kind of compensation to enable them to
yes,
to be secure?
It would, as there's every likelihood this disease will develop, it will be much more comforting to myself to know that they will have the financial reserves to carry on in some sort of resemblance of the lifestyle that I would be able to give them if I was alive.
Now, Gary, excuse me one moment, Gary Corns and Lee. Gary, you were HIV positive. You decided to go ahead and have a child with Lee, but your gamble didn't pay off. What happened?
I was tested in 85 of March, and I was found negative. And in September 85, I was tested positive. I've got a 3-year-old son of a previous marriage, and he's negative, and my former wife's negative. Me and Lee knew the risks, and we went for it, and it didn't pay off. She contracted the HIV virus, and little Christopher, my baby, he's got it as well, so it didn't work.
And how old is Christopher?
He's 9 months.
So what do you think would help you, so 3 of you now who are suffering from the HIV virus?
The government to pay up now. It's no good in deciding something in March, and when the court cases do start in March, to pay something then. We need it now. There's going to be more that's going to die now, and every week that's going to be passed by. We need something. We want to die with a bit of dignity. Me and Lee used to earn nearly £300 a week. We get £92 a week off the social. And you say that's justice. You say that's justice.
You should be getting a minimum of £20,000 each.
What a year?
No, as a payment.
In terms of compensation.
As a payment. So the government has actually given an average. I'm not saying this is all that the government ought to give. I've explained my point of view. But, I mean, everybody should have had in excess of 20,000. The average is £28,000. So it's something. The government has cared so far to that extent.
Will that enable people to die with dignity, as Gary Holmes has mentioned?
It's a help. I agree with Jack Ashley that provided we make absolutely certain that this is a one-off matter and that there are no other possible cases in which you can give no-fault liability, and provided it is made absolutely clear to all concerned that the money has still got to come from somewhere, and it'll come from the National Health Service or it'll come from the Treasury, and it will mean 3 hospitals less, then we should go ahead and do it. But we've got to realise it can't be done without cost.
Dr. John Hickey.
This, I think, is the major problem here. I don't think there's a single person in this room who doesn't have the greatest compassion for these people, but logic would dictate one thing and one's emotions would dictate the other. If you compensate people on a no-fault basis, such as in this case, what do you do when the people who are the subject of, who are pursuing the Myrdale litigation, the benzodiazepine litigation at the present time, and they come saying, we're a special case as well? If the taxpayer or the government decides to compensate these most unfortunate people, I think you should recognise that it is setting a precedent. It's on the road to a no-fault compensation system. Now, if that's the way that the people want to go, that's fine. But I think it's important to recognise it is on the way to a no-fault compensation.
Okay, let me just ask, are there any taxpayers here who would actually begrudge the money to the people we are talking about?
Can I ask what is meant by settlement? Because what I think the plaintiffs mean is that the government should pay up 100%. I mean, everybody knows in these sort of cases that almost any case will settle at a price, and no doubt a settlement could be arrived at on the basis of a small percentage payment. But what I understand the plaintiffs are saying is that they would like 100% of what they would get if they were to succeed in full. Now, that seems, well, perhaps but...
David Waters.
Absolutely not. I think a settlement in full would be very much more than the £100,000 which the lawyers indicated a year ago, if we look at current settlements. I was going to ask what a 100% settlement was, because I don't know what a 100% settlement for life can be. But the real point in this case, to answer Dr. John Hickey, is that the High Court judge has made it very, very clear that he is prepared to surround this case with so many special circumstances, and I think that is what distinguishes this case from all the other cases. And perhaps if that were to happen in the other cases before the courts, that would be okay. But he is the person who has set the fence.
May I say something about that?
I'm afraid we've run out of time. I would just like to say that I'm sure this debate will go on, but please, can we just show our appreciation for the people who've come in and share this debate?
The plight of the haemophiliacs has deeply touched Central Weekend viewers. So far, not one call in support of the government's line. How can Kenneth Clark sleep at night, asks David James from Derby. These poor people and their families must get proper compensation, says Sharon Appleton of Aylesbury. And Mr Bell from Stourbridge says, if the government was facing murder charges, it would think twice. And Mr Smith from Leicester asks our Tory MPs, who would they blame if one of their family got AIDS this way? And one last one here to tell you about. One last one here. Janice Murray from Northfield says a lot of people in this country should be ashamed of themselves. If we had more blood donors in this country, we would not have had to import infected supplies from the USA.